Hey guys, Nike here. I wanted to do this video because I see a lot of questions on Reddit and forums about the topic of why people aren't able to match or sometimes even come close to the QT benchmark numbers. I am by no means a master of doing benchmarks myself, but I do understand a lot of the tricks and small edges to be gained conceptually. Before I go into different things, I want to be crystal clear up front. Not all of these tricks are applicable to actual raid settings, and mastering them won't necessarily make you a better raider. Additionally, there's a lot of RNG involved in all benchmarks, especially for power classes. The weapon strength of ascended weapons has a range upwards of 10%, which means that for any particular skill, there's a potentially 10% variation in the numbers you get from it. In reality, this averages out, since you're going to hit the golem hundreds of times per benchmark. However, many classes have several skills that hit harder than normal skills in the rotation, and re-rolling RNG on them till you get the desired output does happen quite a bit. The point I'm working towards is that if you were getting close to the number, like within 500 to 1,000, you're basically there, and you really don't need to fret over the rest unless you're willing to grind. In the grand scheme, what this should be about is making you a better raider and getting better parses in actual raids. The benefit of practicing rotations on the golem is to build up muscle memory of a rotation so that in an actual raid, you can put more of your mental focus on mechanics and positioning and less on the specific button presses you're doing. This will mean less tunnel visioning on DPS and better overall results for your team. So with all that said, as I mentioned at the start, I see lots of posts from folks who are asking for benchmark help, not because they're trying to find that last 500 DPS, but because they are several thousand off and have no idea where their mistakes are. So I want to go over some of the tricks of the trade. Many of these will be really obvious, but some of them are perhaps less obvious and more helpful to a general audience. So first up is to make sure you have all the right buffs on you, including food, and to make sure that you have the golem have all conditions, especially 25 vulnerability. I know this sounds very obvious, but I've seen dozens of posts from people who are only getting 20k DPS on an Ellie, but when they post their rotation video, they aren't using any food, or they don't have 5 stacks of Grace of the Land, or they don't even have Vuln on the Golem, and so on. QT explains on the benchmark section of their website what buffs are considered meta buffs and which are not. A lot of people who are newer to raids vastly underestimate how important using best-in-slot food is to the end numbers, so please always ensure that you do. The second tip is precasting. Not every profession can benefit from precasting to push their golem numbers, but many do. For an Ellie, having the first tick of damage on the golem be the Nimbus Cloud from an arrow overload is huge. For an NG, casting incendiary ammo and waiting until right as it's about to expire to start your rotation and then casting it a second time, thus getting 2 uses out of it right at the start, will really help your opening burst. You may think that this is negligible, but it is a 0 casting time skill that adds 36 seconds of burning, so doubling it to 72 seconds makes it one of the most powerful skills in the game. As discussed, Ellie makes huge uses of precasting as this NG, Condi Ranger, and Condi Thief. If your profession is able to precast and you aren't doing it, you are losing copious amounts of DPS compared to the benchmark. Precasting, however, is something that you can do in raids, and thus it is not really a shady way to manipulate benchmarks. Condi Thieves are notorious for timing their ready up check to coincide with the cooldown of their venoms and start each burst with a double venom burst. So it's completely reasonable. A related skill that applies to every profession is mastering your opening burst. Most professions have very strong opening bursts, which makes sense as every skill will be off cooldown along with your weapon swap. If you watch the top benchmarks of each class, the opening handful of skills in the beginning of the rotation are done very quickly and crisply. Any experienced benchmarker will tell you if you don't get a good opening burst, you might as well reset because you cannot make up for it later if you start off poorly. From my own personal experience, a really great Condi PS opening burst is around 28k. A decent opening burst would be lower 27ks. A mediocre opening burst is in the 26k range, and a very bad one is in the 25k band. For the people out there who are tryhards, resetting anything below 28k is necessary in order to push a good ending number. But even for an average raider, I would suggest practicing your opening burst so that you can beat 25k every single time. While these numbers are specific to con DPS, the lesson itself applies to all professions. Practice and learn the range of opening bursts, and you will get better at getting superior ending numbers in the long run. So those first three are fairly obvious, but now we're going to delve a little bit deeper into the nitty-gritty. One of the biggest DPS losses that most people don't immediately notice is damage lost from interrupting your auto attacks. A lot of people doing rotations are very focused on their big damage skills coming off cooldown and are mashing them as absolutely soon as they are able to. But if your skill comes up off cooldown halfway through, say, the third auto attack in your auto attack chain, which typically hits harder depending on the profession, it's almost always worth delaying for a quarter of a second or so to allow the auto attack to finish. For example, the third auto attack in the Guardian Greatsword chain hits for around 14,000 damage and has a rather long cast time. Let's say over the course of a benchmark, you interrupt the skill 3 times to cast one of your traps off cooldown. Well, add that up, it's going to cost you about 42,000 damage, which in a 2-minute benchmark equates to about 350 DPS. Over the course of that benchmark, that 350 DPS will really add up. And this is applicable to every profession in the game, some less punishing than others, but definitely a skill that you don't typically see happening in the best benchmarks. The next technique I want to talk about is crisp weapon swap skill casts. Maybe this sounds somewhat obvious, but I'm sure there are many players out there who are unaware that you can start casting your skills after a weapon swap or elemental attunement before the animation of the swap on your skill bar has completed. Much like interrupting auto attacks, if you wait for the skill bar animation to complete before pressing the cast button on your first skill after the swap, on the new set, you're going to be losing about a half a second of DPS per swap. This might not sound like much, but typically a build will swap weapons about 10 times per benchmark. That works out to be 5 seconds of lost DPS, and hypothetically, for a DPS build, this is going to work out to be something like 1,300 DPS lost over the course of a benchmark. This is simply a huge amount of damage to give away, and goes a long way to explaining why people aren't hitting really great numbers. So how do you rectify it? When you hit your weapon swap, you have to know ahead of time what skill you're going to cast next, and press the button immediately after the weapon swap with no delay whatsoever. Related to this is my final tip, interrupting long aftercasts. Many skills have what are known as aftercasts, which are animations that your character performs after the casting of the skill is complete and are actually unnecessary to perform in order to get the full damage from the skill. Some skills have longer aftercasts than others, and knowing which skills have hefty aftercasts and the best way to interrupt them is critical to achieving top DPS. The skill testing aspect of this is that you can easily get too aggressive and interrupt the skill itself and not complete the skill's channel, which will wreck your DPS. It's a matter of practice to interrupt the aftercast without interrupting the skill itself. For con DPS, one of the worst aftercasts in the rotation is Flaming Flurry at the start, and at the start of the Berserker rotation, you can interrupt the aftercast with a weapon swap quite easily. But after the final Flaming Flurry, the best way to interrupt is with a Stow Weapon Press. Similarly, Guardian Greatsword 4 has a hideously long aftercast, and simply moving will interrupt it perfectly with no lost DPS. For Elementalists, the fire auto attack, Fireball on Staff, has a really long aftercast, as does Meteor Shower, and many LAs are practiced in using Flame Burst to interrupt them with a DPS skill, which will allow them to flow into their next attack skill smoothly with nothing lost. It's hard to put a number on this because each rotation is different, but in the context of Guardian, you may cast the Greatsword symbol 15 or so times per benchmark, and that can save you around 5 seconds of DPS by the end of a rotation, which could amount to almost 1,300 more DPS on the end of your benchmarks. So that's it, guys. I really hope this video was helpful. I hope some of you guys didn't find this completely to be old news. But I'm sure a lot of you else have great tips that you can share, which you can leave below in the comments, especially profession-specific tips, because I didn't really get too deep into what each individual profession can do. But if you do have any profession-specific tips to share to improve your benchmarks that aren't super intuitive and the common person might not know about, for sure let me know in the comments below, along with any questions anyone might have about increasing their benchmarks. So that's it, guys. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.